I'm Alice. Standing in the doorway of the old farmhouse, I watched as my stepmother, Amelia, lifted my chair away from the Thanksgiving table as if it were a piece of trash. The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that speaks volumes about the unspoken agreement to ignore me. I held my coat over one arm and a plain white envelope in the other, my hand steady while hers trembled on the chair back. Little did they know, the house they were sitting in had never truly belonged to them. 3 weeks ago, I had finally unearthed the paperwork that proved it, and I was the only one at that table who had read it. My journey into the heart of this family secret began much earlier, in a life that seemed worlds apart from this moment. I'm a palliative care nurse, spending my days comforting strangers in their final hours. It's a job that has taught me the true meaning of dignity, a lesson I've had to learn the hard way in my own family. I've always been the calm one in a crisis, the person others turn to for support. But in my father's house, I've always felt like a ghost, a silent observer in a family that never truly saw me. For years, I convinced myself that this was just the way some families were. I was the disappointment, the one who never quite fit in. The invitations to Thanksgiving always came with strings attached, a reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. Amelia would call, her voice bright and false, offering me a conditional welcome. "You're welcome to come," she'd say, as if I were a delivery driver dropping off a package. "Just don't bring any of those strange dishes you make, and no hospital stories at the table." I'd always say I'd think about it, but I'd always end up going, hoping that this would be the year things would change. This year was different. 3 months ago, my father, Henry, had a heart attack. As a nurse, I was there for him, sitting by his bedside in the ICU while Amelia slept at home and my stepsister, Bella, posted prayer requests online. In those quiet hours, I allowed myself to hope for a real conversation with my father, a chance to ask him about my mother, who I barely remembered. But as soon as Amelia reclaimed the room, the window of opportunity closed. While Henry was in the hospital, the family asked me to bring him some items from home. Among them was an old envelope with a law firm's name on it. I read a line on the envelope before I realized I wasn't supposed to see it, Harper Trust. That was my mother's name, a name that had been forbidden in this house for as long as I could remember. Henry saw the envelope in my hand and snatched it back, saying it was old junk. But I knew there was more to it than that. The name Harper Trust haunted me for days. I'm not an impulsive person, but I couldn't let it go. I started to dig deeper, quietly gathering information. I called my father a week after he was home and asked him about the trust. He lied, telling me it was just a small account that had been closed years ago. But I knew better. I've dealt with enough estates to know that a trust is not a small account. It's a legal structure designed to protect assets and ensure they are distributed according to the wishes of the person who created it. I decided to confront Amelia next. We were in the kitchen, the same place where she had told me this was never my home when I was a child. I asked her if she knew anything about the trust, and the temperature in the room dropped. She denied everything, calling me a dreamer and telling me I was imagining things. But I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear I had seen in my father's. Just as I was about to call the county recorder's office to look into the matter further, I received a call from Lucas, Amelia's younger brother and the family lawyer. He warned me to let sleeping dogs lie, saying that dredging up my mother's affairs would only cause stress for my father. But I knew he was just trying to protect himself and the family's secrets. I thanked him for his concern, but I didn't let his words stop me. I remembered an old neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived next door to my mother when I was a child. I tracked her down and visited her one Saturday morning. When she opened the door, she looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You have your mother's hands." Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. No one in my family had ever compared me to my mother, let alone mentioned her name. Mrs. Thompson invited me in and told me about my mother. She said my mother had been a strong and independent woman who loved the house more than anything. She had created the trust to protect me and ensure that I would have a home when I grew up. She had also made Mrs. Thompson promise to give me a wooden box when I was grown and came asking for answers. Mrs. Thompson handed me the box, and I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from my mother, addressed to me. She wrote that she was sorry she wouldn't be there to see me grow up, but she knew I would be strong. She also wrote that the house was mine, and she had put it in the trust to protect it from anyone who might try to take it away. Under the letter was a photograph of my mother and me on the porch of the house, and under that was a photocopy of the trust document. I spent that night poring over the documents, trying to understand the full extent of the situation. I knew that the trust was still in force, and that the house had been held in my name since I was a child. But I also knew that my father, as the trustee, had failed to fulfill his legal duties. He had allowed Amelia and Bella to treat the house as their own, and he had never told me about the trust. I made an appointment with a lawyer, Miss Reed, and brought her all the evidence I had gathered. She listened to my story and then told me that I had a strong case. She also told me that I had a narrow window of opportunity to take action, as the trust would distribute the property to me outright on my 35th birthday, which was just a few days after Thanksgiving. 2 days before Thanksgiving, my father called me. His voice was thin and weak, and I could tell he was struggling to find the words. "Are you coming Thursday?" he asked. I said I was. He started to say something about my mother, but then I heard Amelia's voice in the background, sharp and angry. "Henry, who are you talking to?" she demanded. My father's words died in his throat, and he quickly said, "Just drive safe. Amelia's got it handled." The day before Thanksgiving, Miss Reed called me with some bad news. She had found out that Bella had taken out a substantial loan to fund her event planning business, and she had used the house as collateral. The loan was significant, and if the house was transferred to me, Bella would be in serious financial trouble. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and assembled the envelope. It contained a certified copy of the deed to the house, a letter explaining the trust, and a formal demand for an accounting from my father. I also wrote a note for my little brother Ethan, who was the only one in the family who had ever shown me kindness. I told him that none of this was his fault, and that I would always be there for him. Thanksgiving morning, I received a text from Ethan. "Mom's in a real mood today," he wrote. "She's already snapping about the seating and going on about you. Maybe you should skip this year." I thought about his words for a moment, but then I knew I couldn't back down. I texted him back and told him I was coming, and that he didn't have to worry. As I drove to the house, I thought about all the Thanksgivings I had spent there, feeling like an outsider. But this time, things would be different. I was no longer the disappointment, the one who was ignored and dismissed. I was the rightful owner of the house, and I was going to take back what was mine. When I arrived at the house, I parked my car behind Bella's expensive SUV and my father's old truck. I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the porch where my mother had once laughed with me in her arms. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and got out of the car. I walked into the house, and the smell of turkey and wood smoke filled the air. The table was set for a feast, with the good china and candles. Amelia was at the head of the table, directing traffic and looking as smug as ever. Bella was setting out water glasses, with her baby daughter, Lily, on her hip. My father was sitting in his chair, looking smaller and more defeated than I had ever seen him. Lucas was there, too, holding a glass of wine and watching me with a wary eye. I hung my coat by the door and went to take my usual seat at the end of the table. But before I could sit down, Amelia stood up. "There's been a little change," she said, her voice bright and false. "We're a bit tight on space this year with the baby and all." She walked over to my chair and pulled it out from the table, carrying it across the room and setting it against the far wall. "There's no room for disappointments at this table," she said, her voice dripping with venom. For a moment, I felt a flash of anger. But then I remembered why I was here. I took a deep breath, set my bag down on the table, and picked up the white envelope. "You're right, Amelia," I said, my voice calm and steady. There isn't room at this table for disappointments. But let's talk about who the real disappointment at this table actually is. I walked over to my father's place and set the envelope down on his plate. "Open it, Dad," I said. He looked at me with a pleading expression, but I didn't back down. "Please, Alice, no," he said. "Not here." But it was too late. Amelia snatched up the envelope and tore it open. As she read the documents, her face turned pale. "What is this?" she demanded. I looked around the table at all the faces, the witnesses my mother would have wanted. "That's a certified copy of the deed to this house," I said. "It shows that my mother, Sarah Harper, put this farmhouse and all this land into a trust before she died. A trust with one beneficiary. Me. This house has been held in my name since I was a child. Not yours, Amelia. Not Dad's. Mine." My father buried his face in his hands, and I could see the tears streaming down his cheeks. "I was going to tell you," he said, his voice broken. "I kept telling myself I'd tell you every year. But it was too little, too late. I had spent my whole life being treated like an outsider in my own home, and I wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily." Amelia exploded. "You ungrateful little girl," she screamed. "We raised you. We fed you. We housed you. And this is how you repay us?" I looked at her calmly. "You raised me to believe I was worthless," I said. "You made me feel like an outsider in my own home. But the truth is, this house was never yours to give. It was always mine." Bella found her voice next. "This doesn't change anything," she said, but her eyes were wide with fear. "The house? Fine, whatever. But my business, I have a loan. I have plans." I looked at her pityingly. "You took a loan against a house that was never yours to pledge," I said. "When the house comes to me, that collateral disappears. You're going to have to find a way to pay off that loan on your own." Lucas tried to interject, but I cut him off. "You, Lucas, were the family lawyer," I said. "You knew I was the beneficiary of the trust. You knew my father was supposed to keep me informed. But you buried the paperwork and helped them keep me in the dark. You're going to have to answer for your actions." I turned to Ethan, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, looking scared and confused. "None of this is about you, Ethan," I said. "You were just a kid. You did nothing wrong. When the house is mine, there will be a place for you here. If you want it." He looked at me with tears in his eyes and nodded. I then looked at Lily, who was reaching out her little hand to me. "Lily is my niece," I said. "And no matter what happens between me and her mother, she will always have a roof over her head. I won't punish a child for the mistakes of the adults." Amelia sat down hard in her chair, her face a mask of shock and anger. She had never expected me to fight back, to expose the truth. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it anymore. I picked up my chair from the wall and carried it back to the table, setting it in its rightful place. I looked around the room at my family, the people who had spent my whole life making me feel like I didn't belong. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said, my voice filled with calm and resolve. "This is the last Thanksgiving you will ever run in my house." I picked up my bag and walked out of the house, feeling a sense of liberation. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be legal battles and hard decisions to make. But I also knew that I had finally taken back control of my life, that I had reclaimed my dignity and my rightful place in the world. That Saturday, on my 35th birthday, the Harper Trust distributed the property to me outright, just as my mother had intended. Ms. Reed handled the paperwork, and I drove out to the house as the legal owner for the first time. I stopped at the gate and scraped the patch of newer paint off the gate post. Underneath, carved into the old wood, was my mother's name, Sarah Harper. I painted it fresh and white so that it could be seen from the road. The following week, I sent out the accounting demand to my father. He didn't fight it. I think he was relieved to finally be able to set down the burden he had been carrying for so long. Amelia and Henry had to make other arrangements, and I gave them a fair timeline to move out. I wasn't interested in being cruel, just in being done with the past. Lucas is dealing with the bar complaint now. Ms. Reed says it doesn't look good for him, and I hope he learns a lesson from this. Bella's business collapsed when the collateral disappeared, and I feel sorry for her, but she made her own choices. Ethan moved into the spare room, and we're working on a fair rent arrangement. He's the only family I've kept, and keeping him has cost me nothing because he's the only one who's ever offered me anything. We have dinner at the long table in the room with the candles sometimes now, and there is finally room for everyone. I've learned that the people who say there's no room for you are often standing in a space that was yours all along. And dignity is not something you argue for or beg for. It's something you quietly take back, in the light, with your mother's name freshly painted on the gate.